to make good use of our time. We have myself, Reva Bearwall, and Dr. Samantha Schoon. We're co-presenting on a subject that we're really passionate about, and we hope to share some insights that we discovered on a research study that we did. So the title of this is Evaluation of Behavior of Transitional State Foods, and how does benchtop performance, what I mean by benchtop is what you do not in a patient's mouth, but an IDDSI test that is done outside the mouth. But how does that compare to inside the mouth? So let's see here. These are the disclosures, and you can take a second there to read them. And what I really wanted to do is start off the conversation by talking about transitional foods. How many of you are involved in IDDSI testing in your facilities or in your practice? It's starting. It's like
we travel between multiple facilities.
Okay.
So we're like educating the other side.
You're seeing the trickle down effect,
Yes.
right? There's a lot of confusion surrounding it. There's a lot of, some anxiety, right? And then trying to get everyone to follow a protocol, right? How are we going to test this? How are we going to classify? I've actually witnessed a lot of conversation around level 7, 6, 5, and 4. I would have to say that's my area of interest as well. But not many people talk about transitional foods. If you look at the pyramid, it's right there on the left-hand side. It's kind of like a little gray area. It is a gray area, and so it's very appropriate. And that's what we want to share some insight on. So the definition, if you look at what's written, it's foods that start as one texture but change into another texture in either the presence of moisture, or presence of moisture or temperature change. Okay. There should be no biting or minimal chewing required to break down a transitional food. And there's no size restriction mentioned. And the degree of texture transition is variable. But the testing that is used is a fork pressure test. So at minimum, everything should pass the IDDSI fork pressure test. So what is a fork pressure test? So here I have an example from IDDSI website, and what you do is you take that portion of food and you cut it into a segment that's 1.5 by 1.5 centimeters, and that's your test sample size. You set your timer to 1 minute, and then what you do is you put your sample in I would say like a little container about that size should do it. Shallow container, and you put 1 cc or 1 milliliter of water in it. You start your timer, 1 minute, okay? And then you take it out and use a fork pressure test, and literally you see the little blanching that's happening to the thumb. The thumb needs to blanch, and that's approximately 17 kilopascals of pressure, okay? Then you look at your test matter, and I probably don't need this. And then it should change form. At minimum, it needs to not look like the original form of the food. Does that make sense to everybody? So this is something that I'm bringing to you from my world of food science. No one's really categorized transitional foods. It is one category, but actually, if you think about it, if you look at the types of foods, they're all branded foods, really. Okay. Unless ice chips is excluded, of course. But it starts into two categories in my mind. One is solid foam and one is solid gel or liquid. And you can see the examples in the solid foam. All of them are solid at room temperature. But what they need is moisture. And it's usually, it's saliva in the mouth, right? And they can decompose and change shape and change texture. The solid gel or liquid it needs temperature, right? It goes in the mouth is body temperature, and then it will break it down, okay? But if you leave Magic Cup from the freezer into room temperature, it's gonna turn to a pudding consistency. So that is a solid gel, okay? So what is the value? Well, the uses are amazing, right? It's like that hidden gem, in my opinion, because it can be used as a rehabilitation training food, right? People who are going from, say, a texture that is puree, and you're trying to see if you can transition them to a level 5 or a level 6 or a level 7, it can be used as a training food. It's a screening tool. How we are looking at, choosing the least restricted food for patients, and this is a great way to use a transitional food. And so it actually, you see it on the sidebar, and you see it go from 7, 6, and 5, but actually those are the different areas where it can start its transition, right? It can be a level 6 transitional food, and then it can transition down, etc. Okay? The value, well, they're ready-made. As people are focusing on breakfast, lunch, and dinner and making sure those are texture modified to the appropriate texture, what I see transitional foods as being an option for a ready-made, take it from the freezer, take it from the shelf, it's good to go. They're finger foods, predominantly in the solid foam category. You saw all those things, whether they're wafer cookies, shortbread, those are finger foods, which support eating independence for our patients. And they address texture boredom. It is the one category where it addresses that the food doesn't have to be wet, right? So you can have a food that has a texture that will transition, hopefully safely for the patient, into a more appropriate texture. It liberalizes the diet, and it falls into our category of desire to have more person-centered care. So the purees are out there. I've been to so many seminars, and I'm sure you have, on the innovative techniques that are coming out. Totally exciting. Purees are focused on the main meal. That's where the innovation is happening. I know that puree exists as snacks, but really they're piping it. They're trying to make it visually, we eat with our eyes. They're trying to make it visually appealing. So you're molding the food. And I've played with this, I don't know if you've played with this too, but I've tried to mold my meatloaf into a shape that, is appealing. There's 3D printing, which you can see there at the bottom in the pizza demonstration. It's puree, but they're trying to make it look eye appealing. The focus on transitional food innovation is really, it's that interim meal, okay? There's literature out there on saying interim meals is an opportunity to gain nutrition, gain calories in someone's diet. It is really, with dysphagia, I think we should transition from 3 square meals a day to maybe 5 or 6 square meals a day. Like making them into smaller portions that they can more easily accept visually and as well with their swallow. So what we have here is that we're looking at how quickly does it dissolve, right? The dissolution properties, and that's the innovation that's happening. What are we putting in the ingredients to stabilize it at room temperature just enough so that it dissolves to that appropriate level in the mouth? And we are trying to make transitional foods more nutritious, right? Because categorically in the past, if you look at children's first finger foods, they're not really focused on nutrition, but as an adult and even in pediatrics, we want that to happen. So what are the studies on transitional foods? Well, Dr. Shun and I combed the literature, and there really is not that much out there. And we really need to focus on figuring out this new category and how it applies in our daily lives. In the study by Awadallah looked at children's finger foods. Well, there's 9 branded finger foods. Gerber owns about 7 of those brands of finger foods, but no one had product tested these finger foods until Awadallah did last year. And amazingly, only 2 met all 3 criteria by the American Academy of Pediatrics. You can see those 3 criteria on the left. How is it that only 2 meet all 3 criteria? What does that tell us about first finger foods? It means that we need to actually product test first finger foods. We should use the fork pressure test on first finger foods because they might not be dissolving adequately for us. The branding says they dissolve, but we need to do our own testing. Now, this is dear to my heart. I am an oral reconstruction specialist, And when I learned about your world, and I tried to integrate your world into my world, I said, wait a second here. The IDDSI testing is geared towards that benchtop test. That test where it's in water. But in my world, I do oral reconstruction. I deal with saliva, right? I deal with what happens to whatever prosthetics I make in the mouth. And I wanted to see how IDDSI can work in the mouth. So I looked at the categories that seem to be dysynchronous to me, right? And I looked at water. What is the pH of water? I know it's a logarithmic scale. So if your pH goes from 6.5 to 8.5 for water, and it goes from 6 to 7, the difference between 6 and 8.5 is a logarithmic difference, right? So that's a very big difference in acidity levels. Also, we look at saliva. It contains mucins, right, to lubricate our food. It actually has digestive enzymes to start the process of digestion. So how is it going to behave on transitional food compared to water? It's going to start breaking it down differently, I think, right? So the temperature is not defined in the IDDSI, which I think is a big thing. If we know that those liquid, gel state foods have temperature as a factor as described by IDDSI, we need to actually say what temperature is the water that we're testing it in, right? Like that totally makes sense. And in the mouth, our mouth temperature is 97 to 99.5. The time, 1 minute. How many of your patients hold food in their mouth for 1 minute, right? What is the average? You know, I see in health that the average is 1 to 12.8 seconds. So 1 minute, maybe if you have a really slow transit time, it would be appropriate. But I wanted to test and ask you guys to start thinking about that when we're testing our transitional foods. And the quantity of saliva is hugely variable in the mouth, okay? So we have, people with dry mouth and non-dry mouth. I couldn't actually find a lot of data about how much saliva is in a dry mouth. But in health, it's like 0.33 to 2.3 milliliters per minute. So the questions are all transitional foods created equal? We wanted to look at that just like Awadallah looked at it for pediatric foods. What is captured or not in the IDDSI testing method? And now Dr. Schoon's going to come and talk about the study.
So our current study really focused on two primary research questions. The first question was, how is the dissolution of solid foams influenced in the mouth by a variety of different variables? So time, pressure, saliva quantity, really getting at those differences between the benchtop IDDSI testing and some different things that we think are occurring in the oral cavity. The second question was geared towards, do different transitional foods perform differently on the IDDSI transitional food test? So we have a single testing method for the benchtop testing, but we know that different products may very likely perform differently even on that benchtop testing. So a lot of information here, but just a quick rundown of how the study worked. This study was open to any individual over the age of 50. Very limited exclusion criteria and very broad inclusion criteria. So these individuals could have or not have xerostomia, no exclusion criteria related to disease status. It was really meant to look at a wide variety of individuals to be representative of what the typical population might be. So each of these individuals came in to the lab and they were set up in a little station like is pictured here, so blocked from view from what else was going on. And the first thing that they participated in was a training on 17 kilopascals of tongue pressure using the IOB. So as Dr. Berwal had described the fork pressure test before, that the fork is pressed down to be about 17 kilopascals of pressure, we wanted individuals to feel what that felt like on their tongue so that the tongue could, in some form, mimic what the fork pressure test does outside of the mouth. Once they were calibrated to that degree of tongue pressure, they were then presented with 4 de-identified samples of each snack type, and I'll mention the snacks in the next slide in a moment. And they were given that 1.5 centimeter by 1.5 centimeter sample, so again mimicking the fork pressure test, but having the test basically occur in the mouth this time. So samples were placed in the mouth, and then they were spit out after a certain degree of time and a certain amount of pressure that was provided to it. In between the different samples, they were provided a short break and some water so they could essentially return to neutral, and their salivary flow could return to neutral before they trialed that next sample. So the different foods that were tested, we had 5 different products, or 4 products plus a bonus. So we looked at the Savories cracker, the Savories cracker plus the hummus dip, shrimp chips, baby mum-mums, and the Eat Bar. All of these products are either marketed to specifically be a transitional state food, or they are listed in the IDDSI guidelines as representative of transitional state foods. Each of those samples underwent then these 4 different conditions. So they were placed in the mouth for 5 seconds with no tongue pressure. They were placed in the mouth for 5 seconds with that 17 kilopascals of tongue pressure. They were placed in the mouth for 12 seconds with that consistent tongue pressure, or they were placed in the mouth for 12 seconds with a pulsing tongue pressure. So overall, we did have 30 adults participate, 17 were female. Mean age was about 66.7 years. We had 9 participants who self-reported either they felt they had or had a diagnosis of dry mouth, and 7 reported a diagnosis of dysphagia or swallowing impairment. We did have a few participants who had allergy restrictions, so unfortunately they were not able to trial every product. So one individual had a dairy allergy, which limited their ability to trial the Eat Bar, and then 2 participants had a shellfish allergy, so they were not able to do the shrimp chips. And again, the dry mouth and the dysphagia diagnoses were before they came in with those diagnoses. For our statistical analyses, we ran some generalized linear mixed regression models. We compared the dissolution rates with the fork pressure test at 5 or 12 seconds with or without tongue pressure by transitional snack type, as well as explored the impact of dry mouth on dissolution rate. Unfortunately, our numbers were a bit smaller when separating out dry mouth versus non-dry mouth, so you'll see those analyses are separated. So this is just the initial breakdown of how each snack did across the 4 different testing conditions. And what the percentage here shows is how many times they passed, and I'm using pass in quotes because we know nothing we do as speech pathologists is pass or fail, but how many times the product passed the fork pressure test. So that yes, it indicated it was a transitional state food after undergoing this condition. And what you'll see is there was a wide variety of differences both across the rows, so within a given product, across the products within a given testing condition, as well as within the columns, so within a given product. I just said the same thing. I'm going to back up again. So in the columns, within a given product across the testing conditions, and in the rows, so within a given testing condition across the different products. And what we found was that first, the Savories cracker did perform better than the other products that were tested. So compared to the shrimp chip, the baby mum-mums, and the Eat Bar, the Savories cracker was significantly more likely to dissolve to that pureed consistency. We also found, looking at the bottom, that the baby mum-mums performed worse than the Eat Bar. And then looking in the middle, we also found that the baby mum-mums performed worse than the shrimp chip as well. And so this was collapsing across the conditions, looking at comparing the snack types to each other. As I said, we did compare those individuals with dry mouth to those individuals without dry mouth. And what we did find comparing these two groups is that across all 5 snacks at the 5-second mark, there was a trend for improved dissolution in the non-dry mouth group. So what might be expected, by 12 seconds, that difference was not there anymore. So having that increased time in the oral cavity eliminated the difference between the individuals who self-reported dry mouth and the individuals who self-reported non-dry mouth. Differences in dissolution rates were also seen across the snack types for the dry mouth group. And so here is dissolution within the dry mouth individuals at 5 seconds with and without tongue pressure. And again, we see similarly that the products did not all perform the same as each other. The last step in the study that we did, so we now took out the individual participants and we just took the snacks and performed the IDDSI benchtop testing on them. And what we see here is more similarity across them. The baby mum-mums again did perform more poorly on that benchtop IDDSI testing as compared to the other products. But the savories, crackers, the shrimp strips, and the Eat Bar all had a relatively high rate of, again, quotes, noticing quotes, passing that fork pressure test. So initial conclusions from the study itself, we did see wide variability in the degree and speed of dissolution in transitional foods, especially in the oral environment. The condition that the snacks underwent mattered. We saw different rates of dissolution depending on how long those snacks were in the oral cavity and whether tongue pressure was present or not. There was a higher percentage of fork pressure test positive results on the benchtop than intraorally. So again, remembering that slide I put up about the IDDSI results and how most of them were in the 80 to 100% range, which was not the case when we tested those same products intraorally. So I think one important take-home message from that is that it's really necessary to assess dissolution on an individual basis due to patient-specific oral conditions. It's not enough to just test a product on the table in front of you and say, yes, this product is considered a transitional state food. What we're likely going to see is differences in the performance of the transition or the dissolution based on individual specific oral conditions. Saliva quantity certainly can be a factor. Individuals with dry mouth might experience a slower rate of dissolution of certain transitional foods, but not all. So we did see some differentiation there across the different product types. And we also noted that pulsing tongue pressure did seem to improve dissolution specifically for those foods that seem to be slower dissolving. So those ones that at 5 seconds were not really passing that fork pressure test, but by 12 seconds were. The addition of tongue pressure specifically for those products may be most valuable. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Bearwall one last time to kind of wrap it up.
All right, so final slides. I just wanted to kind of bring it all together for the audience. So I really feel transitional foods are an avenue for nutrition and food enjoyment. And we looked at research on age-related differences. Really interesting article there if you want to jot it down, because snacking habits are different across a lifespan. And what we saw was, in this research study, they started talking about how the 72 plus, they're not snacking as much, and the caloric intake they're getting is more refined carbohydrates as they get older. And there is an opportunity in snacking for us to provide more calorie dense, more protein dense, more nutritious food to enhance their caloric intake and prevent malnutrition, protein and calorie malnutrition. I also found this other study, which, you know, it's like everything is connected, I feel. The work that we do connects to other research that's done and promotes our thinking towards more research in the area. I was so excited to find in this food sensory study that people are created different, and how our behaviors are to eating are different before they have dysphagia. The majority of us are crunchers with our food, right? But then there's some that are chewers. There's smooshers, I have to say that and not say 10 times fast, And then there's suckers of food. And when you have dysphagia, what happens? Do the crunchers feel more of a deficit with dysphagia than, say, the sucker population or smoosher population? Maybe so, right? And the closer we can get to mimicking what their pre-existing behavior, what they're attracted to in food, the more likely we're going to try and help them have more food enjoyment with their current texture modified diet. The other thing is, I notice when people have transitional food, whether they need to or not, they start moving their muscles of mastication and start chewing that transitional food. What are they doing there? They're following behaviors that are learned. But what is happening is it's stimulating the masticatory muscle function. There must be a link between increased function and increased stimulation in the swallow reflex and the muscle tone in the swallow muscles. And I really feel like we need to start thinking about masticatory muscle function. How is that stimulatory? Is it just to muscles? Is it to nerves? Can it help with cognition? And someone has done some research in that area that warrants further exploration. And I'm really excited about improving patient engagement with their food. If we can make food more socially engaging, more socially acceptable, that food that other people would want to eat, are we going to encourage positive attitudes towards that food from our dysphagia population? Warrants further discussion, and in fact, Dr. Schoon is going to be talking about that tomorrow at her poster. So I conclude with that, saying we need to do more research. This is just the beginning, and I'm excited to follow the future in transitional food. So we open the floor to questions, if anyone has any questions for us.
I wondered if you ever considered using one thing, a compensatory strategy that I teach a lot is to use oral moisturizer mouthwash before my patients eat, maybe 5-10 minutes before they eat to get the saliva going. So. And
is it with a specific texture modified level, or is it ubiquitous?
Just with all of my patients who have dysphagia, who have dry mouth. I don't know, I just kind of started doing it to see what would
that's
happen,
brilliant.
And they love that.
No, I think it's great because in my patient population, I have a high number of xerostomach patients.
Yeah.
And anything that causes friction in the mouth, right, when you're eating, that's lack of saliva, it's going to affect the disintegration of that food. So my question would be, do we have to augment the texture modification because they do have xerostomia and they don't naturally have that liquid level? I mean, when I look at the inverse pyramid, I'm seeing increased liquid content in foods as it moves down the levels. And maybe you could speak to that, but I really think that what you're doing is you're helping to enhance lubrication, improve comfort for the patient, and hopefully that biotin rinse or whatever you're using lasts the whole length of time of feeding, because one of the biggest things is the effect deteriorates pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, because one risk, especially with texture-modified diets, is increased dryness. I mean, anytime you try and puree something up or you start giving them ground meat, that's where we lose a lot of the moisture in the food. And so these individuals, it's like a double whammy. Now they're eating foods that are drier and they have a drier mouth. So I agree. I think that's a great idea. And I think that can increase salivary flow as long as they're not at risk for, say, aspirating. That increased salivary flow should help with consumption.
With the baby mom, I think they're also marketed as like a teething project, but do you think that had any effect on why it was almost like an outlier compared to the other samples?
Yeah, it's funny. We were actually talking about that, and it's always the hindsight 2020. Another great thing to try would have been something like a puff or one of those. But we wanted to try it because it is specifically listed in the IDDSI guidelines as an example of a transitional food. But I think you're spot on that the mums, they're also intended for them to just kind of hold and gnaw on a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
My question, when they gnaw on it and it breaks in their mouth, that as a parent, I can remember when my kids were small, like I want that thing to transition. I wouldn't want it to stay solid in a small piece coating to it. It's almost like it's like a hard bake on the outside, but to dissolve that hard outer shell took a long time.
Yeah. I think the other thing about mum mums too is that often kids aren't eating them right away, so they're sitting exposed to air for a while. And we know that transitional state foods are going to change when exposed to air for a significant amount of time. They're likely to become denser, especially in this case of the baby mum mum. So that's even another consideration is, well, now they're gnawing on it and it's been sitting out for an hour, 2 hours, 2 days. My kids always would find it in the car. And then they're gnawing on it. And same thing, what happens when that big chunk gets into their mouth?
It